During the Depression, people did what they had to survive. Some became vagrants. Some took bad jobs. Some did things they weren't proud of. Otis did it all.
You're listening to tonight's Terror, original horror stories to hear in the dark. Subscribe and share if you're a fan. And now, tonight's story.
It was the first day of spring when Otis arrived in Durant. He shouldered his canvas bag and climbed down from the boxcar he'd slept in, moving careful so he didn't twist an ankle on the ballast. The train had hauled him up and out of Louisiana while he slept. Sometime before dawn, without his knowing it, he'd passed through Arkansas for the first time since he was a boy. Now his boots were on Oklahoma ground, and the morning was colder than he'd expected. The Durant train depot was deserted, and Otis was thankful for that. He needed to clear the train yard without a train warden or cop hassling him. He'd been busted for vagrancy before, and while an arrest would mean at least 2 meals, he was determined to stay clear and find work. As Otis picked his way across the train yard, the hiss of the train behind him was deafening in the chilled morning air. The sound covered the scrape and crunch of his feet on the loose stone among and between the rail ties. The main street in Durant was a little more lively. A few shop owners were already unlocking their doors. The newsstand was piled high with papers. The big man behind the counter stood with his arms crossed, the hint of a smile on his face. He looked like he knew he'd sell all his papers. Otis stepped closer and tilted his head up to get a look at the photo on the front page. He saw a small, angry-looking man behind a microphone. "Hey kid," the man behind the newsstand was talking to Otis. "You want a paper? Big news. The war in Europe's heating up. Could pull us out of this mess." Otis looked up and smiled faintly as he shook his head. "Well, it's not a library. You can't read my papers if you can't buy one." The newsman's voice had a sudden bite that caught Otis off guard. He turned and wandered off, not willing to explain that even if he could spare the money to buy a paper, he couldn't read it. A part of Otis was pleased that the man had suspected, even for a moment, that Otis was a potential customer, or literate. The last thing he wanted was to look the part of a vagrant. In 1939, looking poor was about as dangerous as being poor. Until recently, Otis was both. He ran his hand over the lapels on his jacket, brushing away some train yard dust. 3 nights ago, he'd had a pair of companions on the train. One had introduced himself as Douglas, and the other one would only be addressed as the Prince. Douglas had been in bad shape from the start. He wore a fine gray suit without a spot on it, but he looked like death. He coughed and wheezed miserably while Otis tried to sleep. In the morning, the Prince had asked Otis to ride up top for a while. He said that he and Douglas needed to speak privately about the end. Otis had been so shocked that he'd agreed without argument. In truth, he would have listened to anything the Prince had said. He was an enormous man with rough, heavy hands. After an hour riding on the boxcar roof, laying on his back to avoid the worst of the wind, Otis heard a tapping sound. He crawled to the edge of the car and looked down. The Prince was wrapping a stave of firewood against the metal ladder that led to the roof. Taking this as his sign to return, Otis climbed down and stepped back inside the car. It was dark, and his eyes hadn't adjusted. He couldn't see into the back of the car, but from what he could see, it was only the Prince and himself in the boxcar now. "Where's Douglas?" Otis asked meekly. "Douglas has passed on to receive his final reward," Prince said magnanimously. Otis furrowed his brow as he tried to untangle the euphemism. "He died," Prince clarified. "Went fast. Not much pain, despite all that coughing." Otis looked beyond Prince to the darker end of the boxcar. He saw no corpse. There were only the men's bags and a heap of clothing. "Where did he go?" Otis asked, bemused. The prince sighed heavily, not having expected to need to explain himself. "He's gone," he said flatly. His eyes flickered briefly to the open car door. Otis understood. The clothing in the corner belonged to Douglas, and somewhere in the nameless landscape behind them, the body lay naked beside the track. In the tense hours that followed, the prince had convinced Otis that he needed a new suit if he wanted a chance at a job or a meal in Oklahoma. The Depression wasn't over, not in the South anyway, and Otis would need the folks in the next town to believe he had something to offer, that he was different from the hundreds and thousands who wandered through, begging, panhandling, stealing, and starving. "So let's do business," the prince said at last. "What you got in the satchel?" The few dollars Otis had were sewn into the satchel strap, and he wasn't telling the big man about those. This man had probably just killed his friend and heaved him off a moving train for a funeral service. Otis didn't want to make a deal. He wanted to get away. "I've got my daddy's Bible," Otis said finally. He'd considered selling it dozens of times over the years, but hadn't been offered a fair price. "Let's see it," the prince ordered. When Otis had pulled it out and held it up for the big man to examine, the prince whistled with admiration. "Gold leaf inlay on the cover," he crowed. "That's a prize. Okay, I'll give you the suit, shoes, and the last of Douglas's tobacco. I know a man who'll give me a square deal on a good book that good." And so, 2 days later, Otis stood on Main Street in Durant, Oklahoma, looking the part of a well-to-do man of means. Douglas's shoes hadn't fit him, so he carried on wearing his leather work boots. He was hungry. Otis was always hungry. This morning he would have to ignore the dull aches tightening in his gut. He needed real money. And that meant he needed an inn someplace. A part of Otis believed what the prince had said. The suit would do the talking. He just needed someone to give him a look, listen long enough to give him a chance. Before they found out he was a dirt-poor drifter who couldn't read the label on a bottle of Coca-Cola, he'd have proven himself. He'd be embedded. He set his sights high and entered a department store. The aisles were wide and clean. Big windows let in plenty of light. The shelves of merchandise shone brilliantly. Otis was dazzled. Before long, a man in a pinstriped suit and blue bow tie approached him and asked if he needed any help. Otis had never been asked that question before. Every place he went, he was expected to help someone else. Lift this, drag that, clean this. No, sir," Otis said, smiling politely. The man in the bow tie scowled. "Then what is it you need?" Otis didn't catch the venom in the man's voice, and with a thrill, believed the question meant his interview had begun. He straightened and cleared his throat. "I'd like to work here, sir. I have experience in stores." The man scoffed and glanced around, grinning as if looking for another to share in his delight. "Young man, I don't wish to make a scene, but I have to ask you to leave. If you head downtown," he gestured with an open hand, "there's a boarding house. Sometimes they have leads on farm work." As usual, it took Otis a moment to piece together what was happening. Following the man's gaze back toward Main Street, Otis understood he was being told no. He took a step back and looked the bow-tie man up and down, as if to memorize the figure. Then he turned and began toward the door. He looked back and saw the bow-tie man speaking with another salesman. Neither bothered to stifle their laughter. Could you smell him from over in hardware? Otis had been wandering down Main Street for several blocks when he began to notice people looking at him. One woman even stopped walking to gawk. He noticed her eyes drop. Glancing at his feet, he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. He had boots on, after all. Otis wondered if leather work boots looked foolish with a suit. At each business, Otis paused at the door and tried to work up the nerve to go in. Each time he remembered the sneering man in the blue bow tie. picking him out for a tramp before he'd spoken a word. As Otis wandered, he felt the familiar hollow begin to open in him. Not hunger yet, just the place where he knew it would settle. He tried not to think about Arkansas, tried not to remember the first weeks after he'd left home, when the days slipped past without meals, and his body began to thin in ways he hadn't known were possible. His ribs had stood out sharp against his skin. His stomach had sunk inward, cratered and sore. By the 5th day without food, his thoughts had started to blur, simple things tangling and slipping away from him. He stopped walking and stood there for a moment, letting the feeling pass. Then he moved on. Soon enough, Otis found himself standing in front of the Durant boarding house. The place was worse for wear. Peeling paint, a sagging porch roof, a screen door hanging off one hinge. But there was a light on by the front window, and Otis took its warm yellow glow as a welcome. When he tried the front door, he found it locked. He stepped off the porch and started around the building. It was near the back door that he saw the chickens. The back door was open when Otis tugged on the handle, and he stepped inside. 3 heads turned to face him, a woman and 2 rough-looking men. "Good morning," Otis said. "You looking for a room?" the woman asked skeptically. $2 a week. That comes with 1 meal a day." She nodded toward the 2 men and their plates of eggs. "That sounds fine," Otis said. "But I just came in to tell you folks it looks like a fox got to one of your chickens." The woman stood abruptly. The 2 men exchanged glances and pushed their chairs back. "Come on, boys. You can use my rifle. Maybe we can get him this time," the woman said. She rushed out of the room, and the 2 men followed. Otis started after them, and then paused at the threshold. He looked at the table and the half-eaten breakfast. He didn't hesitate. He dove for the nearest plate like a starved animal. The food was gone in an instant. He cleaned another plate in seconds. The woman and the 2 boarders were still outside. He could hear their voices, raised and urgent. He knew the state of the chicken out there would have them spooked. Without a real plan, Otis moved through the house toward the front room. There, he found a desk, like one he'd seen in hotels. A big book lay open on it, ruled with lines and columns, filled with writing. Otis imagined it helped the boarding house woman keep track of who came and went. Pinned to a corkboard beside the desk were several notices, each with large black lettering at the top and smaller words below. Otis glanced down the hall toward the dining room and the back door, then back again. The house was quiet. He reached across the desk, tore down every notice, and stuffed them into his pocket. By the time the 3 strangers came back inside to find their breakfast gone, Otis had unlocked the front door and disappeared into the growing crowd on the street. Otis was surprised by the number of people moving through downtown Durant. He hadn't spent much time in towns of any real size. By the time he put some distance between himself and the boarding house, he was feeling hemmed in by the passers-by and workmen crowding the street. He tucked himself into an alley and leaned against the corner of a building to regain his bearings. The impulse to help himself to a breakfast he hadn't paid for and to snatch the papers he hoped were work notices had come on quickly. He wasn't going to write any letters home bragging about what he'd done, as if there were anyone to receive them, as if Otis knew how to write one. But he wasn't going to lose any sleep over it either. What he needed was someone who could read. Otis made his way through life as an unlettered man without much issue. But in the few moments when he needed to read something, he needed it badly. He didn't feel ashamed that he couldn't read, but he did feel angry. It felt like the whole world was in on a joke he didn't get. Like they could all see the secret those black marks on the page would give up if you just knew how to look at them. He wanted someone who didn't look like they were in a hurry, but everyone seemed to be on their way someplace. They walked fast. Anyone walking slowly was carrying something. He scanned the crowd until his eyes landed on a boy of 12 or so. Otis stepped in front of him and smiled. The boy stopped short and looked Otis up and down, the same way everyone else in Durant had done since he'd hopped off the train. "Can you read?" Otis asked. "Yes, sir," the boy said. "Are these work notices?" Otis asked, offering the papers he'd taken from the boarding house. The boy took them and studied them for a moment, flipping from one to the next. He looked up at Otis and smiled. "Yes, sir, they are, but most of them are real old." "What's the latest?" Otis asked. "This one," the boy said, passing a sheet of crinkled paper back to Otis. Otis didn't take it. Was the boy mocking him? He hadn't learned to read in the last minute. "What's it say?" Otis asked, nodding at the paper. "It says, Buckley Farm seeks trained farmhands, steady wage, room and board, clean beds, pork dinner." The boy, tired of the interaction and tired of waiting for Otis to take the dirty paper back, let it fall to the ground and walked on before Otis could ask anything else. "You mean Red Buckley?" the man at the grain warehouse asked. Otis had been picking his way through Durant, asking for directions to the Buckley farm without any luck for the better part of an hour. He'd been ushered out of a cafe and completely ignored back at the newsstand. He got the idea to ask at the library and was set to go in when he noticed a cop sitting on the bench outside. If the cop got the idea that Otis was a tramp, he'd be followed all day until he left town. Or worse, end up in a jail cell. Wanderers like Otis traded stories like that all the time. Being poor was as dangerous as being criminal. Most cops didn't see much difference. When Otis saw a tractor pull out of the large warehouse near the end of Durant's business district, he figured they might know the farm he was looking for. "Yes, sir. Red Buckley sounds right. What sort of farm does he own?" Otis asked. "Sorghum, last I checked. He's hanging on. All the grain crops are down to 55 cents a bushel. Come to think of it, I don't know how he's keeping the lights on," the man said, adjusting his suspenders. "I read his notice. I'm looking for work," Otis said. "You and everyone else. Well, I'll give you credit. You're not stealing or panhandling. Durant thanks you for that," the grain man said. Otis said nothing. The man continued, "If I had to guess, nobody local turned out to take that job. Folks don't take to Buckley, and he sure don't take to them. If you go out there, you turn up in daylight with both hands showing. You make some noise about it, too." A voice called out, and the grain man turned to go. "Where's the farm?" Otis shouted. 13 miles south of town. You'll see it. Red Silo," the man called over his shoulder. Otis had been walking for 3 hours when a red smudge appeared on the horizon. His fine suit was dusty, his collar soaked through with sweat. No matter, he thought. The notion of landing a cushy job where he'd need a suit had evaporated back in town. The red smudge took shape as he carried on down the road. Little breaths of dust rose with each step. The worst of the Dust Bowl drought had passed, but Otis could still see long stretches of unplowed earth, cracked and starving for rain. It was well past noon when he reached the turnoff that led to the farm with the red silo. He was at the fence line and was reaching for the gate latch when the mailbox to his right burst apart. Wood splintered, tin flew. The report of the gun came a half-beat later, sharp and flat in the open air. For a moment, Otis just stood there, staring at the jagged post where the mailbox had been. Then, understanding caught up with him. He was being shot at. He threw himself to the ground and covered his head with his hands. A screen door banged open. Heavy steps crossed wooden planks. Then, a gravelly voice called out, "What the hell do you mean coming to this house uninvited? Hands stuffed in your pockets. What you got? A pistol?" Otis upbraided himself for forgetting the grain man's advice. He'd walked straight onto the property, hands not showing, quiet as a mouse. "No, sir," Otis croaked. He coughed on the dust that had plumed up when he hit the ground. "I'm unarmed. I saw your work notice. I want the job." "Get up," Red Buckley said. "Let me see you." Otis stood and brushed hopelessly at the dust clinging to the wilted lapels of his suit jacket. The farmer was a large man. His face was red, the color of butcher's meat. Tufts of white hair sprouted from beneath his hat at the temples. One big hand rested on the barrel of a gun. "You want to work here?" Red scoffed. "Well, you do look like a fool. I suppose you might be the man for it." Otis said nothing. "You take that get-up off a corpse? What makes you think you can buck grain bags in a suit?" "I've got other clothes, sir," Otis said. "Well, good. There's a cot in the barn loft. When winter comes, if you're still here, you can move into the house," Red said, as if the arrangement were self-evident. "What's the pay?" Otis asked. He regretted it immediately. "You'll eat. Meat when we have it. You'll be dry when it rains, if it ever does," Red said, casting a vexed glance skyward. "The notice said steady wages," Otis said. He knew he was stretching his luck. He was hungry. He was tired. He'd already earned a solution to both those problems. "Steady, yes. Steady at nothing. That notice went up before the sorghum price dropped again. You want the job or don't you?" Otis did. The third night at Buckley's farm, Otis woke up with a start. He lay still, staring up at the rafters as his eyes adjusted to the dark. Something had woken him, but he couldn't hear it now. The 2 cows Buckley kept were below him. He listened to their slow breathing. One shifted its weight and let out a low sound as it settled back down on the barn floor. Then he heard it again, heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside the barn. He rolled onto his side and peered out. There were gaps between some of the planks that formed the wall of the loft. He'd noticed them right away when he lugged his bag up here days before. Otis wondered what Red had meant when he said, "when winter comes." It could get cold at night long before the calendar said it was winter. The yard was lit by a half moon. Otis squinted through one of the narrow gaps in the barn wall. He saw nothing out of place. Then the crunching came again. Red Buckley stepped into view and paused. He was looking straight at the barn. Otis shrank back from the wall. Could Red have seen him? His single eye framed by the planks of the loft? Not in this darkness, surely. Otis waited a long time. When he heard Red's footfalls move on, he leaned back to the gap and looked again. Red was no longer on the gravel path. He was hunched over the covered well that sat neglected in the high grass in the farmhouse's side yard. A large stone the size of a ripe pumpkin rested on the well's circular wooden cover. From his knees, Red shoved it aside. It rolled soundlessly into the grass. The cover slid off the well without much effort. Red had his back to Otis now, but it was clear he was pulling at something, hand over hand. At last, an object emerged. He drew a gray metal case up from the well, the handle tied to a rope. The rope must have been fixed somewhere inside the lip of the well, Otis thought. Red paused. Still on his knees, he turned and looked back toward the road, then at the barn. Otis held perfectly still, convinced his watching eye was buried in shadow. More furtive now, Red leaned over the case, shielding it from Otis's view with his body. Otis heard a latch snap open, then the lid creak. The farmer reached inside and rummaged for a moment before withdrawing his hand. Otis watched closely, but thought the hand was empty. A moment later, the case was sinking back down the well on its rope. Red slid the cover back into place and rolled the stone back on top with smooth, practiced movements, especially for a man of his age. Otis watched as the farmer paced away from the well and disappeared from view. He lay back on his straw mattress. So, Otis thought, Red Buckley had a treasure. The days were hard work. Buckley's temper could be volcanic. No matter how Otis hauled, stacked, or gathered, he earned a biting remark from Red. Too slow, too careful, too careless. There was always something wrong with the way he did it. Sometimes Otis felt Red was right on the brink of striking him. Otis learned quickly not to answer back. Silence didn't soften Buckley's mood, but it kept it from getting worse. Weeks passed. It didn't take Otis that long to understand why the farmhand job had stayed open long enough for him to get it. Men didn't last. Either they quit, or Buckley drove them off. Some mornings, Otis felt less like hired help than something owned. A body put to work and shouted at, never talked to. Each night, Otis collapsed into his cot and slept deeply. He didn't mind the work. He didn't mind the shouting either, not really. He was eating regular meals, and he had a bed of his own, a far cry from the weeks and months he'd spent living rough over the last 3 years. His stomach empty, and his satchel balled under his head for a pillow. Compared to that, Buckley's farm felt almost like a shelter. Each morning he woke with the sunrise and looked down at his satchel. The suit lay folded inside. He'd come to hate the suit. It reminded him of the way the man who called himself the Prince had pressed him for his daddy's Bible. It reminded him of the man in the blue bow tie who'd looked at him like something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Most mornings, Red gave Otis a bowl of oats with watered-down milk, and Otis ate it alone on the farmhouse porch. Today, Red lingered as Otis ate. He sipped coffee and stared out at the road, where little cyclones of dust danced across the view. The man at the grain warehouse in town said grain is down to 55 cents a bushel, Otis said, taking a stab at banter. Red looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Otis carried on. How are you making ends meet? People say the Depression's ending with the war on in Europe, but it don't feel like it to me. Now his boss turned his full attention on him. Otis swallowed hard. Buckley set his clay mug on the porch rail. This farm's mine. I don't owe the bank 1 red cent, he said, venom brimming on his lips. Otis exhaled. He thought that was the end of it, but Red spoke again. And how I make ends meet is my affair. You don't get paid to keep the books, do you? I don't get paid at all, Otis felt like saying, but he didn't. He knew this man who'd hired him with a gun in his hand was liable to pick it up again if Otis stepped too far out of line. He finished his oats and set off toward the barn without another word. It would be another 8 days before Red really spoke to Otis again. That didn't count the daily shouting and abuse. Once, while Otis was heaving a grain bag onto a trailer, it caught on the rusted edge of the bumper. Without warning, Red kicked Otis square in the middle of his back. As he crumpled against the trailer and felt the wind driven from his gut, Otis thought how nimble an old man the farmer really was. In spite of it all, Otis went to bed each night somehow content, as if he were satisfied to bide his time there on that cursed farm, with a maniac berating him at every turn. You staying in your loft at night? Red asked. Otis was hefting a heavy metal bucket of water into the trough in front of the cows. He turned and furrowed his brow in confusion. You heard me. You stayin' put? Red said again. Yes, Otis said plainly. Otis had peered through the crack in the wall many nights. Whenever he heard an out-of-place sound in the farmyard, he checked to see if Red was back at the well. He hadn't been, at least not as far as Otis had seen. Why? Otis ventured, bracing himself for a battery of curses in reply. But Red Buckley surprised him. His face softened in a way Otis had never seen before. Just worried you'll leave. It's been hell keeping help around. A guy just up and disappears. Last one took off in the night. Then his folks came sniffing around, asking questions. Otis nodded cautiously. Red continued, looking at Otis hard. You don't have people, do you? No one back home waiting on you?" Otis shook his head faintly. Red watched him, then nodded. "You best get on," he said. Otis lifted the bucket and left the barn. He wondered why Red would talk to him that way after nearly a month of vicious barbs and taunts. The thought left his mind as the day hurried on. Otis was pulling on his boots one morning when he heard an excited yelp from outside. He hurried down the ladder and stumbled to the barn door, still bleary-eyed with sleep. Red was a few steps off the farmhouse porch. No, not standing. It looked like he was dancing. The old viper of a farmer was hopping and stamping his feet. In an instant, Otis knew why. Rain was pattering down into the dry dust of the farmyard. As he stood there watching the old man hop and strut, the rain grew steady and loud. Without thinking, Otis sprang out of the barn and joined Red in the rain. He couldn't remember a rain that felt so heavy, so full. Over the thunder and driving sheets of water, Red shouted, "This'll pull the crops right up out of the dirt." For the next hour, the two of them sat on the porch, smiling like children as they watched the yard turn to mud. Beyond the barn, the fields drank deeply. Otis imagined green shoots pushing up through the earth by the thousands. "If this keeps up, I may be able to scrape together some pay," Red said, unprompted. Otis didn't speak. He turned slightly and nodded. "You're not going anyplace, you hear?" Red said. "The busy stretch is coming up, and I can't make it on my own." Otis shifted on the porch step and watched the rain sweep across the yard. The cow started acting strange just after noon the next day. It wasn't sick, at least not in any normal way. It stood apart from the other animals, head low, shifting its weight as if the ground beneath it wouldn't settle. When Red prodded it with the toe of his boot, it flinched and let out a low, unsettled sound. "Damn thing's gone off," Red muttered to himself. "Bet she never milks again." Otis stood a few steps back, waiting. Red circled the cow slowly, squinting at its eyes, its legs, the way it favored one side. He bent and pressed a hand into its flank. The huge animal twitched and stamped. "Fetch the gun," Red said without looking up. Otis didn't hesitate. He retrieved the shotgun from the place he'd seen Red set it down many times, just inside the farmhouse door. He returned, holding it the way Red always had, barrel down, finger clear. "Just in case," Red said, nodding at the gun. "If she goes for me." Otis nodded and stood where Red pointed, feet planted in the dirt. The cow watched him with one dark eye, breathing hard through its nose. He realized he didn't know if the gun was loaded. Red hadn't asked him to do that. He hoped the heifer would stay calm. Red leaned in close now, peering at the animal's head, running a hand along its jaw. For a moment, Otis thought Red might ask him to do something else. Hold the cow, maybe, or step closer. But Red only grunted and straightened. "Not today," he said, at last. "But it's coming." That night, Otis lay on his cot in the loft. The barn had settled. One of the animals shifted below him, hooves scraping once against the boards before going still again. Otis rolled onto his side and pulled his jacket closer around his ribs. The straw pricked through the thin canvas of the cot. His shoulders ached. So did his hands. He flexed his fingers once and let them rest. The wind moved through the gaps in the barn wall. A loose board somewhere tapped softly and stopped. Otis adjusted his weight and found a position that didn't hurt quite as much. He closed his eyes. Otis woke to a commotion below him. He crept to the gap in the floor where the ladder led down and looked. Red was moving crates and buckets around the barn. Otis pulled back from the gap, slid his feet into his boots, and went down the ladder. Red was waiting at the bottom. His face was crimson and slick with sweat. I wondered if you were waiting for breakfast in bed, Red snapped. Help me get these animals out of here. As was so often the case, Otis didn't reply. He didn't ask why, and he didn't ask where. He only turned and opened the nearest stall door. He had just begun to pull on the cow's lead rope when a sharp slap to the side of his head sent sparks across his vision. He staggered and turned. Red stood close behind him, both hands clenched, his knuckles pale. What the hell are you doing? Red sneered. Not her. Otis looked at the animal. This was the cow that had been acting ill. Red slammed the stall door shut. Otis jerked his hand back just in time, his fingers stinging. He shoved the hand into his pocket without thinking. We're clearing the barn to deal with her, Red said. His voice sounded far away. His ear still rang. The two men had the rest of the livestock out soon enough. They stood beside one another, facing the offending heifer, now alone in the stall. Red sighed and retreated to the corner of the barn near the door. When he returned, his footsteps were slower, encumbered. Otis turned to see Red carrying the shotgun and a huge sledgehammer. Red set the hammer down on its head with a dull thud. He glanced at Otis briefly and said, I've only done this a few times, and I don't expect to miss. But if I don't get her between the eyes, you be ready on that shotgun. Otis looked at the sledgehammer and then the cow. Red was going to put her down. He hesitated a moment, and Red shrugged impatiently. What's the problem? She's done for. We can get half a year of stew out of her if we do it now. Red reached back and pulled the stall door open. We'll do it here in the barn, he said. Keep the worst of the flies off while we work. Otis didn't speak. He took the shotgun and stepped aside. He watched Red walk around the cow, pushing her in the flank until she took a step toward the stall door. When he decided she was positioned well enough, Red stepped out of the stall and hefted the sledgehammer. The farm was still. There was no wind. Otis heard a mockingbird chattering. You ready? Red asked. Otis nodded gravely. It was clear that the sledge was nearly too much for Red to swing. It was with great effort he got the head up and over his shoulder. He rested his left hand on the hammer's shaft and looked at Otis one more time before focusing on the animal. Otis pulled the trigger. The gun roared. The hammer, already midway through its arc, sailed free of Red's hands. The shotgun blast sprayed the old man sideways with so much force he tore through the barn wall. The gun's barrel breathed a plume of smoke. The quiet returned. The mockingbird began again. Through the haze of gun smoke and swirling dust, Otis looked down at the body of Red Buckley. He was tangled among planks and straw. His upper half lay outside the barn. His eyes looked up, unseen. His waist and lower half, still in the barn, twitched once and went still. Otis looked at the cow. She had scrambled to the back of the stall in terror of the shotgun's roar, or perhaps to dodge the flying sledgehammer. He tossed the shotgun onto Red's corpse and climbed the ladder to his bunk. As Otis heaved the big stone off the well cover, he thought about how immediate it was to kill someone with a shotgun. He had never killed anyone so fast before. The gray metal case bumped and scraped along the sides of the well as Otis pulled it up from the darkness into the morning light. He hauled it over the edge and let it drop into the grass. When his parents had died, almost in unison at the kitchen table, it had taken much longer. The poison Otis had put in their coffee worked quickly, but not quickly enough. He had listened to them choke and sputter for minutes before it was over. Afterward, he'd taken the small stash of money they kept and the gold leaf Bible. He had been gone from that house in minutes. He would be on his way again soon. Otis emptied his satchel and tipped the contents of the metal case inside. The bag would be heavy, heavier than he liked, but worth carrying. He stripped in the farmyard and dressed again in his gray suit. There was a spray of blood on the cuff of the left sleeve. The chicken, Otis thought. He recalled ruining the bird badly enough to hold the attention of the people at the boarding house. The satchel was full to bursting, so Otis tucked his father's Bible under his arm. The gold leaf cover was still pristine. He had been careful with it at every turn. Back on the train, he'd pulled it gingerly from the prince's grasping, rigid hands as he bled out from the wounds around his kidneys. Otis dusted himself off and shouldered the bag. Tucking the Bible tight against his side, he wondered if people in town might take him for a man of God. Otis set off down the road at a brisk pace, the satchel heavy on his shoulder, his thoughts already fixed on a man with a blue bow tie.
Thanks for listening to tonight's Terror. If you enjoyed the story, follow, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps new listeners find the show. Visit tonightsterror.com for all our stories, merch, and more. Until next time, sleep well.